Grab a blanket, turn off the lights, and prepare to be scared.
In the heart of December, the Smith family decided to retreat to their cozy mountain cabin for a Christmas escape. The cabin, nestled high in the Rockies, promised a perfect winter wonderland experience. With snow-covered pines and a frozen lake nearby, it was the quintessential holiday getaway. Little did they know, a massive blizzard was brewing, one that would bring more than just snow. The family arrived just before the first flakes began to fall. They spent the day unpacking and settling in, decorating the cabin with twinkling lights and holiday garlands. By evening, the blizzard was in full force. The wind howled through the trees, and snow piled up quickly, creating an impenetrable wall of white outside their windows. As night fell, the storm intensified. The family huddled around the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and telling stories. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from outside. Mr. Smith, the father, decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, he stepped into the raging storm. The snow was knee-deep, and visibility was almost zero. As he approached the source of the noise, he saw strange footprints leading away from the cabin. Curiosity piqued, he followed the tracks. They led him to the edge of the forest, where he found an old, weathered cabin he had never noticed before. Its windows were dark and lifeless, yet he felt a presence watching him. The wind seemed to whisper warnings, but he pressed on, compelled by an unseen force. Inside the cabin, he discovered a room filled with old, dusty Christmas decorations and a large, ornate mirror. As he stared into the mirror, he saw not his own reflection, but a gaunt, ghostly figure with hollow eyes staring back at him. The figure reached out, and Mr. Smith felt an icy grip on his heart. Terrified, he stumbled back, breaking the mirror in the process. The shattering glass seemed to break a spell. The figure vanished, and Mr. Smith fled back to his family's cabin. Breathless and shaking, he told them what he had seen. They decided to leave immediately, but the snow had trapped them. Desperation set in as they realized they were not alone. The presence Mr. Smith had encountered followed them back. Over the next few days, strange occurrences plagued the family. Objects moved on their own, eerie whispers filled the air, and the temperature inside the cabin dropped drastically. They felt eyes watching them from the shadows. One night, Mrs. Smith woke up to find the same ghostly figure standing at the foot of her bed, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. She screamed, waking everyone up. They gathered in the living room, too frightened to sleep. The figure appeared again, this time in the center of the room. It pointed towards the fireplace, where they found an old, charred letter hidden in the ashes. The letter revealed the tragic story of the cabin's previous owner, a man who had lost his family in a blizzard and had gone mad with grief. He had cursed the cabin and anyone who dared to enter it during a storm. Realizing they needed to break the curse, the family decided to perform a ritual described in the letter. They gathered the cabin's old decorations and created a makeshift Christmas altar. As they completed the ritual, the ghostly figure appeared one last time. It nodded in approval before dissipating into the air. The storm outside began to subside, and by morning, the blizzard had cleared. The Smiths quickly packed their belongings and left the mountain cabin, vowing never to return. The memory of that terrifying Christmas haunted them for years to come, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can lurk even in the most idyllic holiday settings. The Johnston family had always loved their annual Christmas camping trips. This year, They decided to explore a new destination, a dense forest known for its scenic beauty and tranquility. They arrived just before dusk and set up camp near a frozen creek, surrounded by towering evergreens. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine, promising a peaceful holiday retreat. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The forest was eerily silent, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Little did they know, something ancient and malevolent watched them from the shadows. The first night passed without incident, but the following morning, they discovered strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding their camp. Intrigued and slightly unnerved, Mr. Johnson decided to investigate. He followed a trail of symbols deeper into the forest, his curiosity growing with each step. Hours passed, and Mr. Johnson had not returned. Mrs. Johnson and their 2 children began to worry. They called out for him, but their voices were swallowed by the dense forest. As night approached, they heard distant, blood-curdling screams. Fearful for their safety, they huddled together in their tent, waiting for dawn. The next day, they searched for Mr. Johnson, but there was no trace of him. Instead, they found more symbols, leading them to an ancient, overgrown path. Desperation drove them to follow the path, hoping to find him. The path led them to a clearing where they discovered an old, abandoned village. The buildings were decrepit and covered in vines, and the air was thick with an oppressive sense of dread. In the center of the village stood a large stone altar, covered in bloodstains. As they approached, they saw Mr. Johnson lying on the altar, unconscious but alive. They rushed to his side, but before they could help him, the ground trembled, and dark figures emerged from the shadows. The villagers, once human but now twisted by dark magic, surrounded them. Their leader, a tall figure with glowing red eyes, spoke in a language they couldn't understand. Realizing they were in grave danger, Mrs. Johnson remembered an old legend she had heard about the forest. It was said that the villagers had practiced dark rituals to summon a powerful entity, but their actions had backfired, trapping their souls in eternal torment. The symbols they had seen were part of a ritual to break the curse, but it required a sacrifice. Determined to save her family, Mrs. Johnson confronted the leader and offered herself as the sacrifice. The entity agreed, and she was placed on the altar. As the villagers began their ritual, a bright light enveloped the clearing. The ground shook violently, and the villagers screamed in agony as their souls were released. When the light faded, the villagers were gone, and the Johnson family was alone in the clearing. Mr. Johnson regained consciousness, and they quickly helped him up. The forest seemed less oppressive, and the symbols on the trees had vanished. They made their way back to their camp, eager to leave the haunted forest behind. As they packed their belongings, they noticed a small, glowing crystal where the altar had been. Mrs. Johnson picked it up, feeling a strange warmth emanating from it. They took it with them as a reminder of their harrowing experience and the sacrifice they had made. The Johnsons never returned to that forest, and they rarely spoke of the events that had transpired. But every Christmas, they placed the crystal on their mantle, a silent testament to the power of family and the horrors they had faced together. The Miller siblings, Jake and Emily, decided to spend their Christmas break at their family's remote cabin in the woods. The cabin, a rustic structure surrounded by thick forest, was a cherished retreat. They looked forward to spending their vacation there, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. They arrived just before dusk, delighted by the sight of snow-covered trees and the peaceful stillness of the forest. They spent the first evening decorating the cabin, hanging ornaments and lights, and setting up a small Christmas tree. The night was calm, and the only sound was the crackling of the fireplace. The following day, Jake decided to go for a hike while Emily stayed behind to bake cookies. He ventured deep into the forest, marveling at the pristine beauty of the snow-covered landscape. As he walked, he noticed strange markings on the trees, claw marks that seemed too large to be from any animal he knew. He shrugged it off, attributing it to his overactive imagination. Back at the cabin, Emily heard a faint, melodic humming coming from the woods. Curious, she stepped outside and called for Jake, but there was no response. The humming grew louder, and she felt an inexplicable sense of dread. She hurried back inside and locked the door, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. As night fell, Jake still hadn't returned. Emily began to worry and tried calling his phone, but there was no signal. She lit the fireplace and waited, anxiously glancing at the clock. Hours passed, and the silence of the forest seemed to press in on her. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. Emily jumped, her heart racing. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. "Jake," she called out, but there was no answer. The banging continued, growing more frantic. Summoning her courage, she unlocked the door and swung it open. To her horror, she found not Jake, but a grotesque figure standing in the doorway. It was tall with matted fur, glowing red eyes, and long, sharp claws. The creature let out a guttural growl and lunged at her. Emily slammed the door shut and locked it, her mind racing. She knew she had to find a way to protect herself until morning. She barricaded the door with furniture and grabbed a kitchen knife. The creature continued to pound on the door, its growls filling the cabin. Just when Emily thought she couldn't hold on any longer, the pounding on the door suddenly stopped. Silence fell over the cabin, and all Emily could hear was her own labored breathing. She waited for several minutes, knife in hand, before daring to move. Suddenly, she heard a faint scratching noise coming from the window. She slowly turned to see the creature's red eyes peering in at her from the darkness. It snarled and bared its teeth, then vanished into the night. Emily knew it was only a matter of time before it found another way in. Desperation set in as she searched for something, anything, that could help her fight off the beast. She remembered the old hunting rifle her grandfather had kept in the cabin. She ran to the bedroom closet, where she found it covered in dust. Her hands trembled as she loaded the rifle with the few remaining bullets. Armed and determined, Emily took a position near the fireplace, where she had a clear view of the door and windows. Hours passed with no sign of the creature. Exhausted and on edge, she struggled to stay awake. Just as dawn was breaking, she heard a faint knock at the door. Her heart raced as she raised the rifle, ready to fire. "Emily, it's me," came Jake's voice, weak and hoarse. She rushed to the door and flung it open, embracing her brother as he stumbled inside. Jake was pale and shivering, with deep scratches on his arms and face. He told her how he had been attacked by the creature and had barely escaped with his life. They knew they had to leave the cabin immediately, but the creature was still out there, lurking in the forest. They packed their belongings quickly and quietly, hoping to avoid attracting the creature's attention. As they stepped outside, the forest was eerily silent. The snow-covered ground was marked with the creature's large footprints. They hurried to their car, constantly glancing over their shoulders. Just as they reached the car, the creature emerged from the trees, its red eyes glowing with malice. Emily raised the rifle and fired, hitting the creature in the shoulder. It let out a blood-curdling scream and retreated into the forest. They jumped into the car and sped away, the cabin quickly disappearing behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, where they reported their harrowing encounter to the authorities. The locals were skeptical, but some believed their story, recalling old legends of a creature that haunted the woods during the winter months. Jake and Emily vowed never to return to the cabin. Their Christmas break had turned into a nightmare they would never forget, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Young Billy Thompson was excited for Christmas Eve. The house was decorated with twinkling lights, and the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air. His parents had tucked him into bed with promises of Santa Claus visiting during the night, bringing presents and joy. However, as soon as Billy closed his eyes, he was transported into a disturbing dream. He found himself standing alone in a dark, empty room. The only light came from a flickering candle on a wooden table. The walls were adorned with old, torn Christmas decorations, and the air was filled with an eerie silence. Billy's heart raced as he explored the room. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper. "Billy, Billy." The voice sent chills down his spine. He turned around, but no one was there. He tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The whispering grew louder and more insistent. "Billy, come here." He felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder, and he spun around to see a shadowy figure standing in the corner. The figure wore a tattered Santa suit, but its face was a grotesque mask of decay. It reached out a skeletal hand and beckoned him closer. Terrified, Billy tried to run, but his feet felt like they were stuck in quicksand. The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes staring into Billy's soul. "Come with me, Billy," it rasped. "You'll never be alone again." Just when he thought he would be consumed by the nightmare, Billy woke up with a start. He was back in his bed, drenched in sweat. The room was quiet, but the fear lingered. He tried to shake off the dream and went downstairs to find his parents. To his horror, the house was empty. The decorations were in disarray, and the air felt heavy with an unseen presence. He called out for his parents, but there was no response. Panic set in as he realized he was truly alone. He heard the whisper again, coming from the living room. "Billy, come here." He cautiously approached, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure from his dream stood by the Christmas tree, its hollow eyes watching him. "Join me, Billy," it said, its voice cold and menacing. Billy backed away, but the figure advanced. Just as it reached for him, the front door burst open, and his parents rushed in. The figure vanished, leaving Billy trembling with fear. His parents hugged him tightly, and he told them about the nightmare and the figure. They reassured him it was just a bad dream, but the fear lingered. They spent the rest of the night together, keeping the lights on and staying close. Christmas morning arrived, but the joy was overshadowed by the chilling experience. Billy never forgot that Christmas Eve and the terrifying figure that had haunted his dreams. The town of Whitebridge was known for its peaceful winters and festive holiday spirit. But one December, the townspeople were gripped by a series of terrifying events that would change their perception of Christmas forever. It began with the disappearance of a young woman named Sarah. She had been walking home late one night after attending a Christmas party. Her friends said she had taken a shortcut through the town's old graveyard to save time. She never made it home. The townspeople organized search parties, scouring the graveyard and surrounding woods. They found no trace of her except for her scarf, caught on a gravestone. As days turned into weeks, hope faded, and the town was left with a sense of dread. Not long after Sarah's disappearance, strange occurrences began to plague the residents. People reported hearing eerie whispers in the dead of night, and shadows seemed to move on their own. The once festive town was now blanketed in an air of fear. One night, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson was alone in his home when he heard a soft knock at his door. He opened it to find no one there, but a cold breeze swept through the house. The whispers began, growing louder and more insistent. He tried to ignore them, but the fear was overwhelming. He decided to investigate the source of the whispers. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into his attic, where the noise seemed to be the loudest. As he climbed the creaky stairs, the air grew colder, and the whispers more frantic. In the attic, he found an old, dusty mirror covered with a cloth. The whispers seemed to emanate from it. He removed the cloth, revealing a cracked, antique mirror. As he stared into it, he saw a gaunt, ghostly figure with hollow eyes staring back at him. The figure reached out, and Mr. Thompson felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. Terrified, he stumbled back, breaking the mirror in the process. The whispers stopped, and the figure vanished. He hurried downstairs, his heart racing. That night, he couldn't sleep, haunted by the image of the ghostly figure. The next day, he shared his experience with the townspeople. Some dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man, but others believed him, recalling similar encounters. The town's fear grew, and more people reported strange occurrences. Determined to uncover the truth, a group of townspeople decided to hold a seance in the graveyard where Sarah had disappeared. They gathered around her gravestone, holding hands and calling out to her spirit. The air grew cold, and the ground trembled. Suddenly, Sarah's ghostly figure appeared before them. She was pale and translucent, her eyes filled with sorrow. She told them of a curse that had befallen the town, a curse that could only be lifted by a sacrifice. Realizing they needed to break the curse, the townspeople decided to perform a ritual. They gathered items of significance to Sarah and placed them on her gravestone. As they completed the ritual, Sarah's spirit smiled and faded away. The curse lifted. The strange occurrences stopped, and the town slowly returned to its festive spirit. However, the memory of that terrifying December haunted them for years to come. They never forgot the horror that had lurked in the shadows, a chilling reminder of the true nighttime horrors that can emerge during the cold, dark winter nights.